Continued page 163. It was in the last days of October that they tried out Castel's serum. In practical terms, this was Rio's last hope. In the event of a new failure, the doctor was convinced that the town would have to surrender to the whims of the disease, and either the epidemic would continue for many long months yet, or else it would decide to call halt for no reason. On the eve of the day when Castel came to see Rio, Monsieur Othon's son fell ill, and the whole family had to go into quarantine. The mother, who had only recently emerged from quarantine, was thus isolated for a second time. Obedient to the instructions he had been given, the judge had Rio brought in as soon as he recognized signs of the disease on the child's body. When Rio arrived, the mother and father were standing at the foot of the bed. The little girl had been sent off. The child was in the phase of exhaustion and allowed himself to be examined without fuss. When the doctor looked up, he met the magistrate's eyes and also saw behind him the pale face of the mother, who had put a handkerchief over her face and was following the doctor's movements with wide open eyes. "That's it, isn't it?" the magistrate said in a cold voice. "Yes," Rio replied, looking back to the child. The mother's eyes widened, but still she said nothing. The magistrate was also silent. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Well, doctor, we have to do what we are required to do." Rio avoided the eyes of the mother, who was still holding a handkerchief to her mouth. "It won't take long," he said, hesitantly. "If I might use your phone." Monsieur Othon said that he would show him where it was, but the doctor turned to the magistrate's wife. "I'm very sorry. You must get some things together. You know what's needed." Madame Othon seemed struck dumb. She was staring at the ground. "Yes," she said, nodding. "I'll do that." Before he left, Rio could not stop himself asking them if they needed anything. The woman kept looking at him in silence, but this time the magistrate looked away. "No," he said, then, swallowing, "but save my child." At the start, quarantine had been a simple formality. Now Rio and Rambert had organized it very strictly. In particular, they demanded that the members of a family should always be isolated from one another. If one person in a family had been infected without realizing it, they should not increase the chances of the illness spreading. Rio explained this to the magistrate, who was persuaded by the argument. However, the magistrate and his wife were looking at one another in such a way that the doctor felt how devastating this separation would be for them. Madame Othon and her young daughter could be housed in the quarantine hotel run by Rambert, but for the magistrate, there was no place any longer except in the isolation camp which the prefecture was setting up in the municipal stadium with the help of tents provided by the refuse collection service. Rio apologized, but Monsieur Othon said that there was only one law for everyone and that it was right to obey it. As for the child, he was taken to the auxiliary hospital, to a former classroom in which 10 beds had been set up. After some 20 hours, Rio considered his case desperate. The little body was being eaten up by the infection without reacting. Tiny buboes, painful but barely formed, were obstructing the joints of his slender limbs. He was beaten from the start. This is why Rio had the idea of trying out Castel's serum on him. That evening, after dinner, they gave the long injection without a single reaction from the child. At dawn the next day, they all went to the little boy's bedside to assess the result of the decisive experiment. The child, who had emerged from his torpor, was turning convulsively under the sheets. The doctor, Castel, and Tarot had been beside him since 4 o'clock in the morning, following the disease as it advanced and retreated, Thero's solid frame was slightly hunched over the head of the bed. Rio was standing at the foot of the bed, and beside him Castell sat reading some old book with every appearance of calm. Little by little, as daylight spread through the old schoolroom, the others arrived. First Panelo, who took up his position on the side of the bed from Thero, on the other side of the bed from Thero, with his back against the wall. His face wore a pained expression, and the exhaustion of so many days in which he had given to others at the expense of his own well-being had drawn lines across his flushed forehead. Joseph Grand arrived in his turn. It was 7 o'clock, and the civil servant apologized for being out of breath. He would only stay for a moment. Perhaps they already knew something definite. Without a word, Rio showed him the child, whose eyes were closed in his contorted face, his teeth clenched hard as he could clench them, and his body motionless. He was turning his head back and forth, from right to left on the bolster with no sheet across it. When it was finally light enough for one to see the blackboard, which had remained at the back of the room with some old equations on it, Rambert came. He leant against the back of the next bed and brought out a packet of cigarettes, but after looking at the child, put it back in his pocket. Castell, sitting down, looked at Rio over his glasses. Any news on the father? No, Rio said. He's in the hospital. He's in the isolation hospital. The doctor was grasping the iron bar at the foot of the bed, where the child was groaning. He never took his eyes off the little patient, who stiffened suddenly, once more clenching his teeth, arched his back a little at the waist, slowly extending his arms and legs. The small body, naked under the army blanket, gave off an acrid smell of sweat and wool. The child gradually relaxed, brought his arms and legs back toward the center of the bed, still blind and dumb, seemed to be breathing more rapidly. Rio looked toward Thero, who turned away. They had already seen children die. For several months the terror had not discriminated in its victims, but never before had they followed a child suffering minute by minute as they had been doing here since early morning. Of course, the pain inflicted on these innocents had never ceased to appear to them what in truth was an outrage. But until then, they had been outraged abstractly, in a sense because they had never looked face to face for so long a time at the death throes of an innocent child. At that moment, the boy, as though bitten in the stomach, doubled up again with a high-pitched moan. He remained bent like this for several seconds, shaking and trembling convulsively, as though his frail body were bowing beneath the raging wind of the plague and cracking underneath its repeated blasts of fever. Once the gust had passed, he relaxed a little. The fever seemed to move away, abandoning him, gasping, on a damp and polluted shore, where rest already seemed like death. When the burning tides struck him again for the third time and raised him up a little, the child bent double and, throwing back his blanket, fled to the end of the bed, wildly shaking his head from side to side, in terror of the flame that was burning him. Large tears rose beneath his swollen eyelids and began to flow down his pallid face. When the crisis was over, exhausted, tensing his bony legs and his arms, from which in 48 hours the flesh had dropped away, the child assumed the grotesque pose of a crucified man in the ravaged bed. Thero leant over, and with his heavy hand wiped the small face bathed in tears and sweat. A moment earlier, Castell had closed his book and was looking at the patient. He began to say something, but had to cough in order to finish it because his voice suddenly started to crack. There was no morning remission, was there, Rio? Rio said no, but that the child was holding on longer than normal. Panelo, who seemed to have slumped somewhat against the wall, said in a dull voice, "If he is to die, he will have suffered longer." Rio turned brusquely toward him and opened his mouth to say something, then thought better of it and looked back toward the child, making a visible effort to control himself. The light spread through the ward. On the other 5 beds, shapes were tossing and groaning, but with what appeared to be deliberate self-restraint. The only one who was shouting at the other end of the ward was making little cries at regular intervals, which seemed to express astonishment rather than pain. Now there was a kind of assent in the manner of approaching their disease. Only the child was struggling with all his strength. From time to time, Rio would take his pulse, unnecessarily, and rather to escape from the state of powerless inactivity in which he found himself. And when he closed his eyes, he could feel this agitation mingled with the throbbing in his own veins. At such times, he felt himself merge with the murdered child, and tried to sustain him with all of his still undiminished strength. But the beating of their 2 hearts, united for a minute, would cease to harmonize. The child escaped him, and his efforts dissolved into nothingness. At this, he would put down the slender wrist and go back to his place. Along the whitewashed walls, the light changed from pink to yellow. Behind the glass, a hot morning was starting to crackle. One could hardly hear Grand as he left, saying that he would come back. They all waited. The child, his eyes still shut, seemed to be slightly calmer. His hands, now like claws, were gently working away at the sides of the bed. They had climbed upward, scratched the blanket near the knees, and he suddenly bent his legs, brought his thighs up near his belly, and became still. At this point, he opened his eyes for the first time and looked at Rio, who was standing in front of him. In the hollow of his face, as if fixed in clay, the mouth opened, and almost immediately a single continuous cry came out, hardly altered by the boy's breathing, suddenly filling the room with a monotonous, discordant protest, so inhuman that it seemed to be coming from all men at once. Rio gritted his teeth, and Tarot turned away. Rambert went up to the bed beside Castell, who closed the book which had stayed open on his knees. Panelo looked at this child's mouth, soiled by illness, full of that cry of all of the ages. He knelt, and everyone considered it natural to hear him say, in a voice that was somewhat stifled but distinct behind the continuing anonymous hell, "My God, save this child." But the child went on crying, and, all around him, the other patients were becoming restless. The one at the end of the ward, whose shouts had not stopped, stepped up the rhythm of his moan until it, too, became a genuine cry, while the others groaned louder and louder. A tide of sobs broke across the room, drowning out Penelo's prayer, and Rio, clasping the bar at the foot of the bed, closed his eyes, drunk with tiredness and horror. When he opened them again, he found Tarot beside him. "I have to go," Rio said. "I can't stand this anymore." But abruptly the other patients fell silent, and the doctor realized that the child's cry had weakened, and that it was still weakening, and that it had stopped. Around him the moans resumed, but smothered like a distant echo of the struggle that had just ended. For it had ended. Castell went round to the other side of the bed and said that it was all over, his mouth open but silent. The child was resting among the rumpled blanket, suddenly grown smaller, with traces of tears on his face. Panelo went up to the bed and made the sign of benediction. Then he gathered up his robes and went out down the central aisle. "Must we start all over again?" Tarot asked Castell. The doctor shook his head. "Perhaps," he said, with a strange smile. After all, he did fight it for a long time. But Rio was already going out of the ward, walking so quickly, and with such a look on his face that when he overtook Panelo, the priest held out his arm to restrain him. "Come now, doctor," he said. Without stopping, he swept along. Rio turned round and spat out. "Ah, no, that one at least was innocent, as you very well know." Then he turned away, and, going through the doors of the ward in front of Panelo, crossed to the back of the school courtyard. He sat down on a bench between dusty little trees and wiped away the sweat that was already running into his eyes. He wanted to shout out again, to untie the dreadful knot crushing his heart. But the heat flowed slowly down between the branches of the fig trees. The blue morning sky was quickly covered by a whitish film that made the air more stifling than ever. Rio slumped back on the bench. He watched the branches at the sky, and gradually getting his breath back, bit by bit reabsorbing his fatigue. "Why did you speak to me with such anger just now?" said a voice behind him. "I, too, found that unbearable to watch." Rio turned round to Panelo. "That's true," he said. "Forgive me, but tiredness is a form of madness, and there are times in this town where I feel only outrage and revolt." "I understand," said Panelo. "It is outrageous because it is beyond us, but perhaps we should love what we cannot understand." Rio sat up abruptly. He looked at Panelo with all the strength and passion he could muster and shook his head. "No, father," he said. "I have a different notion of love, and to the day I die, I shall refuse to love this creation in which children are tortured." A shadow of profound distress passed across Panelo's face. "Ah, doctor," he said sadly, "I have just understood what is meant by God's grace." But Rio had slipped back into his bench. From the depths of his returning exhaustion, he replied more gently, "Which I don't have, I know. But I don't want to discuss this with you. We are working together for something that unites us at a higher level than prayer or blasphemy, and that's all that counts." Panelo sat down beside Rio. He seemed moved. "Yes," he said. "Yes, you are working for the salvation of mankind." Rio tried to smile. "Salvation is too big a word for me. I don't go that far. What interests me is man's health. His health first of all." Panelo hesitated. "Doctor," he said, then he stopped. The sweat was also starting to run down his forehead. He muttered goodbye, and his eyes shone as he got up. He was about to leave when Rio, who had been thinking, also got up and took a step toward him. "Forgive me again," he said. "That outburst would not be repeated." Panelo held out his hand and said sadly, "Yet I have not managed to convince you." "What does it matter?" Rio asked. "What I hate is death and evil, as you know, and whether you accept this or not, we are together in enduring them and fighting against them." Rio took Panelo's hand. "You see," he said, deliberately not meeting his eye, "even God himself cannot separate us now."